There was a morning when somewhere in the frozen valleys of Ice Age Europe, a Neanderthal opened his eyes, completely unaware that his kind was running out of time. He rose from a cave that his ancestors had occupied for thousands of generations. The mountains were unchanged. The rivers still carved their way through the valleys. Herds of reindeer still crossed the plains beneath towering glaciers. To him, the world looked exactly as it always had. Nothing in the landscape warned that an entire branch of humanity was approaching its final chapter. The danger wasn't hidden in the forests. It wasn't waiting inside the caves. It wasn't stalking across the snow. It was something almost impossible to notice. Far beyond the next mountain range, another human species was quietly multiplying. Not stronger, not larger, simply becoming more numerous. Every year, new fires appeared across the landscape. One camp became 5. 5 became 20. Children were born into expanding communities. Hunters traveled farther than ever before. Ideas spread from one valley to the next with astonishing speed. Without realizing it, the balance that had existed for hundreds of thousands of years had begun to shift. The Neanderthals had ruled Europe for nearly 300,000 years. They endured some of the harshest climates our planet has ever produced. They hunted mammoths weighing several tons using carefully crafted wooden spears. They mastered fire, survived brutal winters, cared for injured members of their families, and buried their dead with remarkable intention. For decades, scientists imagined them as primitive cave dwellers, until archaeology told a very different story. Their brains were as large as, or in many cases larger than, our own. They created sophisticated stone technologies. They understood landscapes. They adapted to changing climates that would have destroyed many other species. By every measure, Neanderthals were extraordinary survivors, which raises one of the greatest mysteries in human history. If they were so successful, why are they gone while we remain? For generations, scientists searched for a single dramatic answer: a devastating war, a deadly disease, a volcanic catastrophe, a climate apocalypse. But as evidence accumulated from caves stretching from Spain to Siberia, a quieter, more unsettling picture began to emerge. The Neanderthals may not have been defeated in a single moment. Instead, they may have slowly disappeared, while watching another human species become impossible to ignore. This is not the story of a sudden extinction. It is the story of the last generations who unknowingly lived through humanity's greatest transition. The final families, the final hunts, the final children, and perhaps the last Neanderthal who ever looked across a distant valley and saw unfamiliar campfires glowing in the darkness. For thousands of years, nothing happened quickly. No army marched across Europe. No empire rose against the Neanderthals. Instead, their world became just a little more crowded, one generation at a time. Imagine standing on a rocky cliff overlooking an Ice Age valley. 40,000 years ago, you might have seen only a handful of campfires stretching across the horizon. Days could pass before one Neanderthal family encountered another. Entire seasons might go by without meeting strangers. Their world was immense. Their population was astonishingly small. Today, researchers estimate that at certain points, all the Neanderthals living across Europe may have numbered only a few thousand breeding individuals scattered over millions of square kilometers, tiny islands of humanity, separated by enormous oceans of wilderness. For hundreds of thousands of years, that way of life had worked. Then another species entered the landscape. Early Homo sapiens did not arrive as an unstoppable wave. At first, they were just another small group of humans moving into unfamiliar territory. But they possessed one quiet advantage that would become impossible to overcome. They connected. Archaeological discoveries reveal something remarkable. Stone blades found hundreds of kilometers apart were often crafted using nearly identical techniques. Shell ornaments from distant coastlines appeared deep inland. Rare stones traveled across enormous distances. These weren't random coincidences. They were signs of something much larger. Ideas, materials, and people were moving between communities. Imagine dozens of small camps sharing knowledge across entire regions. If one valley suffered a harsh winter, relatives in another valley might still survive. If game disappeared in one area, hunters already knew where the next herds had migrated. Every connection became another layer of survival. Neanderthal communities, by comparison, appear to have lived in far smaller, more isolated groups. Many rarely exchanged mates with neighboring bands. Some populations remained separated for so long that their genetic diversity steadily declined. Each child carried more closely related ancestry than the generation before. And that created a silent danger. A disease that killed only a few people could wipe out an entire family line. One failed hunting season might mean there were no neighboring groups large enough to help. A severe winter could erase decades of population growth. Meanwhile, the number of Homo sapiens continued to rise, not because they were stronger, not because they were more intelligent, but because every generation produced more survivors than the one before. Picture the valleys of Ice Age Europe again, every few decades. Another unfamiliar campfire appeared beyond the horizon, then another. Then another. To a Neanderthal child growing up during those final millennia, the landscape itself may have seemed to change. Places once occupied only by reindeer now held strangers. River crossings became shared hunting grounds. Caves that had sheltered Neanderthal families for countless generations suddenly showed evidence of different tools, different ornaments, different ways of living. No single encounter changed history, but together, thousands of ordinary moments slowly transformed an entire continent. Without realizing it, the Neanderthals were witnessing something no human species had ever experienced before. They were becoming the minority in their own homeland, and once that process began, reversing it may have been impossible. History often imagines the meeting between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens as a single dramatic moment. Two groups, standing face to face, one destined to replace the other. Reality was almost certainly far more complicated. There wasn't one meeting. There were thousands. Across tens of thousands of years, from the forests of Western Europe to the mountains of the Middle East, these two human species repeatedly crossed paths. Sometimes they may have noticed each other from opposite sides of a valley. Sometimes they hunted the same migrating herds only days apart. Sometimes they sheltered inside the very same caves, separated not by distance, but by generations. Archaeologists have discovered caves where Neanderthals occupied them for centuries. Then, after a period of absence, Homo sapiens appeared. In other places, the opposite happened. It was as though the landscape itself was slowly changing owners. But ownership wasn't decided by war. It was decided by time. Every generation of Homo sapiens seemed to leave behind more tools, more hearths, more evidence of life. Every generation of Neanderthals left behind, just a little less. Then came one of the greatest discoveries in modern science. For more than a century, researchers believed Neanderthals vanished without leaving anything behind. That idea collapsed in 2010. When scientists decoded the Neanderthal genome, they found something astonishing. The Neanderthals had never completely disappeared. They were still here, inside us. Today, people whose ancestors come from Europe and Asia carry roughly 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. Tiny fragments, but enough to prove something extraordinary. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens didn't only meet, they had children together. Imagine that for a moment. somewhere around a campfire, beneath the same stars we see tonight, two different human species looked at one another, not as enemies, but as companions. Their children grew up carrying the inheritance of both worlds. That discovery transformed our understanding of prehistory forever. This wasn't simply the story of one species replacing another, it was also the story of two human families becoming connected. Yet that connection could not stop what was already unfolding, because every generation created another imbalance. Imagine one Neanderthal child born into a community of 25 people. Now imagine, across the valley, 5 Homo sapiens children, born into communities already linked to hundreds of distant relatives through migration and exchange. The mathematics were relentless. Even if both children survived, one belonged to a population expanding across continents. The other belonged to a population becoming increasingly isolated. Generation after generation, the proportion shifted, not suddenly, almost invisibly. A few more Homo sapiens, a few fewer Neanderthals, then another generation, and another. Eventually, entire regions that had echoed with Neanderthal voices for nearly 300,000 years fell silent. No battlefields marked their disappearance. No monuments recorded their passing. Only abandoned caves, cold hearths, forgotten stone tools, and footprints buried beneath layers of Ice Age dust. The Neanderthals were not erased in a single moment. They simply became fewer, until one day, there were no communities left large enough to remain Neanderthal. Only memories, and fragments of their DNA, living on inside another human species. No scientist knows the exact day the final Neanderthal died. There is no grave marked the last of his kind. No witness recorded his final words. History kept that secret. But somewhere between 41,000 and 39,000 years ago, the last self-sustaining Neanderthal communities quietly disappeared from Europe, not with an explosion, but with silence. Imagine one final family, a father returning from a hunt across frozen hills, a mother repairing heavy fur clothing beside the entrance of a cave, a child watching snowflakes drift through the cold evening air. To them, it was another ordinary day. They laughed, they ate, they slept, they dreamed about tomorrow, never knowing that tomorrow might never come for their people. Across the valley, the lights of Homo sapiens camps continued to multiply. More children were born. More hunting parties crossed the rivers. More shelters appeared where forests met open grasslands. Every season, their world became larger. The Neanderthals' world became smaller, not because they forgot how to survive, not because they suddenly became weaker. The earth itself had changed. Survival was no longer decided by enduring winter alone. It depended on growing populations, sharing knowledge across vast distances, forming larger social networks, and recovering from disasters that would have destroyed smaller communities. In that new world, numbers became a force as powerful as climate. The Neanderthals never truly lost their ability to survive. They simply could no longer replace themselves fast enough. One family disappeared. Then, another. A valley emptied. A familiar cave remained cold through winter. The echoes of voices that had filled Europe for nearly 300,000 years slowly faded into the wind, until one day, there was no one left to answer. And yet, their story did not end there. Inside laboratories, scientists extracted ancient DNA from fossilized bones buried for tens of thousands of years. The results stunned the world. The Neanderthals had never completely vanished. Their legacy had survived inside us all along. Every person of European or Asian ancestry carries small fragments of Neanderthal DNA, genes inherited from encounters that happened more than 40,000 years ago. Some influence our immune systems. Others affect our skin, hair, metabolism, and even how our bodies respond to cold environments. In a very real sense, the Neanderthals did not lose the future. They became part of it. Perhaps that is why their disappearance continues to fascinate us. When we study a Neanderthal skull, we are not looking at an alien creature. We are looking at family, a different branch of humanity, one that laughed, grieved, loved, protected its children, and gazed into the same night sky we see today. Their last day was never truly the end. It was the moment when two human stories became one. The Neanderthals disappeared as a people, but they never disappeared from humanity. And every time we uncover another ancient footprint, another weathered stone tool, or another forgotten cave, we hear a quiet reminder carried across 40,000 years. They were here. They mattered. And in ways no one could have imagined, they are still here.